Hello, readers, and welcome back to Quarantine Literacy. This week is a very special week, and it's one that's near and dear to my heart. We are spending the week talking about disability. Maybe you've heard that word before, disability. So, a disability can mean all sorts of different things. Disabilities can be physical, they can affect your physical body, like your sight, or your hearing, or your limbs. They can affect the inside of your body, your ability to move your body or your limbs, your ability to go to the bathroom on your own, your ability to eat on your own, your ability to speak. They can affect your brain and the way that you interpret information or your ability to learn. And they can affect your emotions, the way that you approach the world, the way that you understand what people are doing or saying around you, the way that you react when someone makes you upset. So disability is a huge, huge rainbow of differences. And we're going to look at what some of those disabilities are this week. I would like to dedicate this week to Luca. Luca apparently loves watching Quarantine Literacy, and I'm so happy to have you as one of my readers. And Luca was actually one of Josie's besties back in New York City. And they have been watching for, I think, since the beginning. So, hi Luca, I'm glad you're watching, and I can't wait to spend the week with you. We're going to start with one of my favorite authors. This was actually this was the first book I read on this YouTube channel, Trisha. You know she's one of my favorites. And this book is called Thank You, Mr. Falker. And this is Trisha. This is Patricia. This is a book about her. This is actually a book written about her struggle with learning how to read. And this is a teacher named Mr. Falker who discovered and helped her discover that the reason that she couldn't read wasn't because she wasn't smart. It wasn't because she wasn't trying. It was because she had a disability called a learning disability. And that means her brain functions differently from a typically developing child. Her brain scrambles words on the page and makes it very difficult for her to read them. Sometimes letters appear upside down. Sometimes letters appear smushed together. Sometimes she just can't hold, kids with learning disabilities can't hold on to information. Their memory is impacted. Their ability to focus is impacted. So it's a beautiful story of her sort of beginning to understand the ways in which her disability affect her ability to learn, and specifically to learn how to read. So I want to share this with you because I work with lots of kids with learning disabilities, and I can tell you that sometimes it affects their reading, and sometimes it affects their ability to write. That's called dysgraphia. Sometimes this is usually a form of dyslexia if reading is a tricky thing. It can be something called dyscalculia. How cool of a word is that? Which means that you struggle with math concepts. And a learning disability is kind of like a big umbrella term. And there's so many different disabilities underneath the inside of that umbrella. So again, like I said, memory or retrieval can be an issue. Focus and attention can be an issue. Reading, writing, math, all of that can be really, really difficult for kids with learning disabilities. So, without further ado, we will begin. Patricia Polacco's Thank You, Mr. Falker. The grandpa held the jar of honey so that all the family could see, then dipped a ladle into it and drizzled honey on the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. Stand up, little one, he cooed. I did this for your mother, your uncles, your brother, and now you. Then he handed the book to her. Taste. She dipped her finger into the honey and put it into her mouth. What is that taste? The grandma asked. The little girl answered, Sweet. Then all of the family said in a single voice, Yes, and so is knowledge, but knowledge is like the bee that made that sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of a book. The little girl knew that the promise to read was at last hers. Soon she was going to learn to read. So I can tell from this sort of ritual that they have and also the conversation that they're having that reading and learning is particularly important to this family. So how do you think it's going to feel for little Trisha if learning and reading is so important to this family that she's going to struggle with it? My guess is that's going to be pretty hard for her, huh? Trisha, the littlest girl in the family, grew up loving books. Her schoolteacher mother read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought his books home from school and shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her grandmother and grandfather read to her by the stone fireplace. When she turned 5 and went to kindergarten, most of all, she hoped to read. Each day, she saw the kids in the first grade across the hall reading, and before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class began to read. But not Trisha. Still, she loved being at school, and because she could draw, the other kids would crowd around her and watch her do her magic with the crayons. In first grade, you'll learn to read, her brother told her. So her strength is not reading, but she has other strengths, doesn't she? She's a great artist, and we know that because this book is about the author, Trisha Falker, and she is also the illustrator of these books. So she drew all of these pictures. So she truly is a very, very talented artist. And that's the thing, you guys. When you think about disability, I want you to remember this. There are some ways in which a kid with a disability struggles in the world, right? Whether it's with reading or walking or seeing. And there are other ways in which that kid, just like any other kid, will excel in the world and has many strengths and much to offer. In first grade, Trisha sat in a circle with other kids. They were all holding Our Neighborhood, their first reader, sounding out letters and words. They said, b, 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 oi, boy, and look. The teacher smiled at them when they put all the sounds together and got a word right. But when Trisha looked at a page, all she saw were wiggling shapes. And when she tried to sound out words, the other kids laughed at her. Trisha, what are you looking at in that book? They'd say. I'm reading, she'd say back to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person. Always when it was her turn to read, her teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the other kids moved up into the second reader and third reader, she stayed alone in Our Neighborhood. Trisha began to feel different. She began to feel dumb. Now, I think a lot of times what happens in this culture, in this country, and in a lot of places around the world is that we equate different with bad. Different is not bad. Different is wonderful. Different is what makes us interesting. If we were all the same, we would not want to hang out with one another. We'd be like, oh, it's like looking in a mirror. Boring. The harder words got for the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. Oh, how she loved to draw. Or just sitting and dreaming. Or when she could, going for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandma were walking together in the small woods behind their farm. It was twilight. The air was sweet and warm. The fireflies were just coming up from the grasses. As they walked, Trisha said, Grandma, do you think I'm different? Of course, her grandma answered. To be different is the miracle of life. You see all those little fireflies? Everyone is different. Do you think I'm smart? Trisha didn't feel smart. Her grandma hugged her. You are the smartest, quickest, dearest little thing ever. Right then, the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms. Reading didn't matter so much. So she's feeling really low and really less than in school. And it's such a shame, especially as a teacher, to hear about somebody who wasn't recognized as having a disability right away. Her teachers didn't see and her parents didn't notice that there was something really going on with Trisha beyond just not being able to read. Some kids take a little longer to read, and that's okay, that's fine. We take all sorts of different lengths of time to learn how to do things. But when you're really struggling the way that she is, you have to be identified. Somebody has to notice so that you can get the intervention and the reading support, the small group or one-on-one focused reading support that's specific to helping kids with learning disabilities. Because if you have a learning disability, your brain doesn't function the way that other kids' brains function. And we as teachers and parents, we have to meet you where you're at, where your beautiful brain is at. And so it's our jobs to make sure that we're giving you the materials and the support so that you can be successful. And this makes me so sad that she didn't have that right away, that she had to go through so many years of school feeling dumb. That word that she used, dumb. She's not dumb, she's brilliant. And look at her, she became a famous artist and author. Clearly, she's amazing. Trisha's grandma used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming from the other side. And she used to say that someday she would be on the other side, where the light comes from. So she's saying that someday she won't live forever, right? And someday she'll die. And then she's saying she'll be on the other side in heaven. One evening, they lay on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven. You know, her grandma said, all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass, or you'll lift right off the ground, and there you'll be. They laughed and both hung on to the grass. But it was not long after that night that her grandma must have let go of the grass, because she went to where the lights were on the other side. And not long after that, Trisha's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now. So one thing that was getting Trisha through school, even though it was so hard for her and she was feeling so different, was having the love and support of her grandparents. And they passed on. And that just must have been so extra hard for her, because then you have that emotional toll of just being so sad. Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page, or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Trisha would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads that just wasn't happening to hers. And numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She never added anything right. Line the numbers up before you add them, the teacher would say. But when Trisha tried, the numbers looked like a stack of blocks, wobbly and ready to fall. She just knew she was dumb. Poor Trisha. Then one day, her mother announced that she had gotten a teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers and kids in her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and brother moved across the country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 days. They look pretty happy there, don't they? She's thinking, maybe I can get away with it in my new school and kids won't know that I can't read. But at the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over the words. The cat ran. She was reading like a baby in the 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Trisha for an answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. Hey, dummy, a boy called out to her on the playground. How come you're so dumb? Other kids stood near him and they laughed. Trisha could feel the tears burning in her eyes. How she longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. There's a term that hurt people. And so I'm thinking that this little boy who's making fun of Trisha is maybe hurting himself, right? He inside is also hurting and he's got pain and maybe there's something going on with him. But boy, is he treating her unkindly. And those kids who are standing by and watching, they're not being good allies. They're not being good friends to Trisha. They're not really making good choices, are they? None of these kids are making good choices by making fun of someone. It's really wrong. I bet you already know that. Now Trisha wanted to go to school less and less. I have a sore throat, she'd say to her mother, or I have a stomach ache. She dreamed more and more and drew more and more, and she hated school. Then, when Trisha started 5th grade, guys, this book, I love it, but it's also so devastating for me because to think that Trisha had to get all the way up to 5th grade before she got any reading help, it just makes me want to cry. The school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and slick gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. All the usual teacher's pets gathered around him. Stevie Joe, Alice Marie, Davy, and Michael. But right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Falker which kids were the cutest or the smartest or the best at anything. Mr. Falker would stand behind Trisha whenever she was drawing and whisper, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" That must have felt good for her, to finally get some positive feedback. When he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and look at her drawings. But they still laughed whenever she gave a wrong answer. Then one day, she had to stand up and read, which she hated. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy when the kids began to laugh out loud. Mr. Falker, in his plaid jacket and his butterfly tie, said, "Stop! Are you all so perfect that you can look at another person and find fault with her?" Now that's a good teacher. He's calling those kids out on being stinkers, They are making really poor choices. And he's like, no poor choices in my classroom. You're not going to get away with treating somebody like that. That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her. All except Eric. He had sat behind Trisha for 2 whole years, but he seemed almost to hate her. Trisha didn't know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her and pulled her hair. He waited for her on the playground, leaned in her face and called her Toad. Trisha was afraid to turn any corner for fear that Eric would be there. She felt completely alone. It's a terrible feeling to be so lonely. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back whenever she got something right, and he looked hard and mean at any kid who teased her. So he's really being a good ally for her. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Trisha, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or in the cafeteria or even in the bathroom and to jump out and call her stupid or ugly. This is some really serious bullying going on, and this is really hard to read about. And I know that none of you would ever engage in this kind of bullying. And I hope, too, that you would be a great ally if you ever heard any of this and you would get an adult and you would stick up for that kid that people are being rude to. Trisha began to believe them. She discovered that if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide under the inside stairwell during the free time and not have to go outside at all. In that dark place, she felt completely safe. Well, that's not okay that she has to just hide from all the other kids to feel safe. But one day at recess, Eric followed her to her secret hiding place. "Have you become a mole?" he asked, and he pulled her into the hall and danced around her. "Dumbbell, dumbbell, maggoty old dumbbell." Trisha buried her head in her arms and curled up in a ball. Suddenly she heard footsteps. It was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric down to the office. When he came back, he found Trisha. "I don't think you'll have to worry about that boy again," he said softly. "What was he teasing you about, little one?" "I don't know," Trisha shrugged. at least I'm glad Eric is going to, get in trouble for his poor behavior, and I'm hoping they're going to help him to figure out how to make better choices. Trisha was sure Mr. Falker believed she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading, or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence, then she'd say the same thing that he did. Good, he would say. Then one day, Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school and help wash the blackboards. He put on music and brought out little sandwiches as they worked and talked. All at once he said, "Let's play a game. I'll shout out letters. You write them on the board with the wet sponge as quickly as you can." "A," he shouted. She wiped a watery A. "8," he shouted. She made a watery 8. 14, 3, D, M, Q, he shouted. He shouted out many, many letters and numbers. Then he walked up behind her, and together they looked at the board. It was a watery mess. Trisha knew that none of her letters or numbers looked like they should. She threw the sponge down and tried to run. So there they are looking at the blackboard. Now, when you have a learning disability, it is difficult to access the regular sort of general ed curriculum in a classroom. And often you'll need special support through either another special education teacher like myself, or somebody who comes in and sort of knows what they're doing and knows how to help you to be able to see and hear and access all the things the teacher is saying and all the words that are on your page in a way that makes sense to your brain. And sometimes that means going out of the classroom and having independent time to really work and focus on specific skills. But often, kids with learning disabilities need at least some amount of intervention or help from other people. Not because they're dumb, not because they aren't trying, but because their brains function a little bit differently. And we have to help all kids where they're at, right? I know you believe that because you're a kid, and every kid has struggles. Every kid has struggles and every kid has strengths, whether you have a disability or not. Mr. Falker caught her arm and sank to his knees in front of her. "You poor baby," he said. "You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you to be so lonely and afraid." She sobbed. "But little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters or numbers the way other people do. And you've gotten through school all this time and fooled many, many good teachers." He smiled at her. "That took cunning and smartness and such bravery." Then he stood up and finished washing the board. "We're going to change all that, girl. You're going to read. I promise you that." Now remember, kids with disabilities, there are things that are harder for them and there are things that are amazing about them, just like with any kid. So yeah, she is smart and brave and cunning. There's all of these attributes of her that are just incredible. Now, almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy, a reading teacher. So there are reading specialists that can help kids with learning disabilities. They did a lot of things she didn't even understand. At first, she made circles in the sand and then big sponge circles on the cute blackboard going from left to right, left to right. Another day, they flicked letters on a screen and Trisha shouted them out loud. Still other days, she worked with wooden blocks and built words, letters, 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 words, 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 always sounding them out. And that felt good. So, like I said, there are specific interventions that involve tactile things like putting your finger in sand or moving blocks, that involve kinesthetic things, that involve visual things and saying things out loud, oral things. So you just have to access the reading in a different way for kids with learning disabilities. Though she'd read the words, she hadn't read a whole sentence, and deep down she still felt dumb. Then one spring day, had it been 3 months or 4, Mr. Falker put a book in front of her. She'd never seen it before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of a page and pointed at it, almost as if it were magic, or as if light poured into her brain. The words and sentences started to take shape on the page as they never ever had before. She marched them off to slowly. She read a sentence, then another and another. And finally, she'd read a paragraph, and she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy had tears in their eyes. So after all that time, getting all the way to 5th grade, she finally was able to get the help that she needed to learn how to read. That night, Trisha ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps, threw open her front door, and ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed up on the cupboard and grabbed a jar of honey. Do you remember what she's going to do? It's from the beginning of the book. Then she went into the living room and found the book on a shelf. The very book that her grandpa had shown her so many years ago. She spooned honey on the cover and tasted the sweetness and said to herself, "The honey is sweet and so is knowledge, but knowledge is like the bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of the book." Then she held the book, honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel tears roll down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. She was happy, so very happy. Well, you can see why I love that book, because it's kind of all the best things that a book has to offer. It's got a roller coaster of ups and downs. It's real. It's got a big problem and a beautiful solution. It's also based on her real life, which I love. It's based on real experience. And I think books are particularly touching when they're based on something that an author has actually experienced. So I look forward to spending a week with you guys talking about disability, and I will see you tomorrow to discuss another amazing book and another type of disability. Until then, bye.